Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at a very positive game. Came out November 28th, 2023, The Last Train Home. A game that is really enjoyable and don't require a high-end PC to play. It's a perfect kind of game for everybody. The minimum requirement is a bit vague, but we're going to figure out on which kind of CPU, GPU and RAM you need to play this game smoothly. First off, they ask 3 GHz quad core. Don't know if it's 2 core 4 thread or just simply 4 core 4 thread. Then 8 GB of RAM, NVIDIA GTX 1050 Ti 4 GB or the Radeon RX 570 4 GB version. You only require 20 GB of hard drive available. Welcome to Respawn PC. I'm Dunk. Let's game on. So I'm going to start low on the food chain of PC hardware and we're going to go up from there to say what we can get on the FPS market. So I'm starting with the i5 650, 8 GB of RAM, the GTX 950 2 GB. I chose that mission in particular because there's multiple kind of shadow and lighting and there's a different density of enemies here and there, making my test as viable as possible. So obviously we are at 720p, low settings, FSR enable, and we reach 24 FPS with that settings. So we are already quite close to 30 FPS. That is if the minimum requirement should be 720p and 30 FPS on low settings. We don't have that information, so we're going to guess. Next up is the same setup, but we replace the GTX 950 for the GTX 960 4 GB. Now we've got quite a jump in FPS, but as you can see, the CPU is quite the bottleneck right now. We're going to see later on 1080p to try to relieve the CPU of some burden, because at 720p, the 960 is having quite an easy life. Only 49-50% of utilization, and the VRAM is not maxed out either. Jumping one generation from the first to the second and dropping to the i3 instead of i5, I got the i3 2100. This one run at 3.1 GHz instead of the 3.2 of the i5 650. Both were released in Q4 of 2013 and both have 2 core 4 thread, but the i3 should be about 10% better than the i5 650. Also went down with the GPU with the R7 370. This is a 2 GB card. And at 720p low with FSR enable, we have a 24 FPS. It's playable-ish. You clearly see that the CPU is the bottleneck in that situation. So we're going to upgrade the CPU. A small but significant upgrade, the i3 2130. This CPU run at 2.4 GHz, still 2 core 4 threads, but a bit more gigahertz in the gut. And that little gigahertz gain give us what we're looking for. So we have a 29 FPS at 720p low. So my guess is we find our winner for 720p low. Let's check out some other combo. But I'm going to keep second generation. So going to jump to the i5 2400. And when you jump on the i5 2400, which is a real 4 core 4 thread instead of a 2 core 4 thread, and it run at 3.1 GHz, you can see the difference in the CPU power versus the i3 same generation. When you play at a lower resolution, it puts more strain on your CPU. So if you're going to play a 720p, have a better CPU than what is proposed or recommended. Because jumping from the i3 to the i5, we also jump the FPS from 29 to 44. That is a substantial gain for a CPU that is now worth $5 to $7. Now trying with other 2 GB card, this is the GT 1030 2 GB GDDR5. If you had made a bad choice in buying your GPU, or if your PC came with the GT 1030, that's your result. You get about 38 FPS for that game. It's highly playable. That card isn't the best decision to get for that price point, but if you get used for really cheap, maybe it's a good decision. With another 2 GB card, the RX 550, we have a hard time to stay at 25 FPS and it's quite unstable. Not every 2 GB card are the same. Don't buy a RX 550. Who want to buy a RX 550? It's even a worse choice than the GT 1030 right now. Unless you get it for free. Don't complain for free, you're probably going to be able to play some game, Castle Crasher. But if you get the RX 560 4 GB, you get quite a decent amount of FPS. You will be exactly in the mid 45 to be exact. And the GPU can be found relatively cheap, but the driver support is ended, if I remember right. Now I just went and want to do some tinkering around, so I upgrade the CPU from the 2400 to the i5 2500 and another 2GB card, the GTX 750 Ti, which is still driver supported. The 3.4 GHz CPU help a lot. In this case, at 720p, we reach a FPS of 43 and the CPU and GPU usage is quite well distributed, reaching high of mid-50s and lows in the mid-30s. It runs really smooth. Next up, I want to do some comparison. So the i5 2500 with the R7 370 with the i5 2400 with the R7 370. Both CPU having similar gigahertz. The 2400 is at a 3.1 and the 2500 is at 3.4. But how much this will impact the gameplay? We gained 3 FPS. The 2400 was at 43 FPS and now we are at 46. Not much of a gain. Now, just to demonstrate the CPU bottleneck, I put the GTX 970, which is a 4GB card, and I left it at 720p low. Here you can see the GPU is only at 39% of usage and getting 48 FPS. It's a little bit more than the R7 370, which was 46, or even the GTX 750 Ti, which was 43. If you have this card, at least play at 1080p, even at medium and some high. Now it's time to find the 1080p real minimum requirement. So I went back to the i3 2100 with the R7 370. Why? Because the CPU was bottlenecking and there was still headroom for the GPU. And when you jump from 720p to 1080p, you relieve some of the burden from the CPU and put it on the GPU. So maybe that will even it out. And in this situation, it's quite a close call. We get a 27 FPS, but still the CPU is the bottleneck. By the way, I went down up to the i5 650 to play at 1080p with the GTX 970 to see how much relief the GPU will take from the CPU. And we are at 21 FPS. A really bad idea. A really bad pairing. Then back on searching the 1080p minimum requirement, I went back to my i5 2500 and the GTX 950. This is a 2GB card and at 1080p low FSR enable, we reach a 38 FPS, highly playable. Maybe you can crank up some settings at medium to reach the target 30 FPS. It seems from the minimum requirement should be a 2GB GPU, not a 4GB. If the goal was 30 FPS, obviously. But normally when they say minimum requirement, they target 30 FPS. Because if you look at the GTX 960 4GB variant, we have an average of 45 FPS. This is highly playable. I don't think they were targeting 45, normally it's 30 or 60 FPS. Yes, the GPU is pegged at 99% of usage, but there is still headroom for the VRAM. But at 45 FPS, we way far from a goal of 30 FPS, 1080p. And the gap is even bigger with the GTX 970. We're now reaching a 50 FPS, close to the 60 FPS. If this were their goal. So you're probably able to crank some settings to medium or even high and reach a 30 FPS and have quite a decent looking game. Same go for the 4GB card on the AMD side. So the R9 380 4GB variant is similar, if it's not the same, as the GTX 960 as a performance. And we actually get similar FPS. The 960 was giving me 45 FPS and the R9 380 gave me 46 FPS, which is a nice pair with the i5 2500 because both were over 90% of usage. But I feel it should be a 2GB card to fill the 1080p low settings 30 FPS because all the other 4GB card give me well over 40 FPS. So I went back to the R7 370 2GB with the i5 2500. And was I right? We reach a 35 FPS. It's not exactly 30, but if you count some place you're going to go a bit lower, it's a nice average. So our winner for the 720p low 30 FPS is the i3 2130 with the R7 370. For the 1080p low, we have a multiple combination. So the i3 2100, the R7 370, which was not exactly 30 FPS, but good enough. The i5 2500 with a multiple GPU, the R7 370, the GTX 950, and the GTX 750 Ti. Mind there's a multiple other combination that you can reach those target, and mind also that all my system is a fresh Windows install. There's no crap and there's no bloatware on my system, any of my system. On that note, thanks to have come watching and subscribe!